The New York Times' Manual of Style and Usage, a 385-page reference guide for Times journalists and editors, includes entries on proper abbreviations, acceptable use of popular cliches, and the difference between Islam and Islamism. In the preface, the editors of the manual urge a thoughtful application of all the guidelines to follow, and they note a piece of wisdom included in earlier editions of the regularly updated volume. A single rule might suffice. The rule of common sense will prevail at all times. How does common sense and its rule prevail over war reportage and the reality it represents? How is sense made common, and what other senses are subsumed in the process? What conditions does common sense impose? In directing journalists to the rule of common sense as a sufficient single rule for their journalism, the New York Times Style Manual echoes theorists such as Michel Foucault, Antonio Gramsci, and Stuart Hall, who understood common sense as a set of rules governing how people speak about the world, rules so powerful and so pervasive as to become invisible within the sites of their emergence. Every social stratum has its own common sense, writes Gramsci, which are basically the most widespread conception of life and of men. Gramsci observes how common sense creates the folklore of the future, a relatively rigid phase of popular knowledge at a given place and time. War reportage can be assessed for the common sense it precipitates, and, thereby, its effectiveness in adjudicating the conception of war in our time and place, and by inspecting the formal strategies through which a sense of war is made common in the news, the self-evidence of both war and its reportage can be called into question. This chapter and the next parse the discursive tropes, rhetorical protocols, and linguistic standards of war reportage in order to map the conditions they impose on the journalistic representation of war. In scrutinizing the obviousness of war's represented reality, in excavating the particularity of the conventions through which war becomes real, the ideological character of war reportage can be glimpsed. Journalistic common sense is revealed as folklore. Here I assess news of war not for how it is practiced or received, but for how it says what it says, and, thereby, what messages journalism's particular discursive design communicates. Rather than interpreting the topical content of the news, then, I examine rules, like those codified in the Times Style Manual, through which journalism assembles a realistic war. These rules predetermine what it is possible for journalism to disclose of war and in what manner. Journalism's generic conventions indicate a field of conditions, a space of organization, in which war achieves a discursive regularity. Here, precisely, is where war reportage perpetuates and reproduces a sense for war called common.